Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered if the way we measure things like prejudice and stereotypes is actually any good? That is exactly what we're diving into today. This paper dives deep into how scientists try to measure racism and prejudice. Think about it. If we want to solve a big problem like prejudice, we need good tools to understand it, right? But what if those tools aren't as good as we think? This study looked at over 260 research papers, going all the way back to 1951 and up to 2024, to see just how trustworthy the measurement methods really are. They screened over 13,000 records to get to this point, which shows they were really digging for answers. The big question these researchers asked is are the common ways we measure prejudice and stereotypes actually good science? They looked at things like whether the test's reliable, meaning they give the same results over and time, and valid, meaning they actually measure what they're supposed to measure. They examined everything from simple questions people answer about their attitudes to more complex tests that look at unconscious reactions. And honestly, the results are a bit surprising. They found that while there are lots of different ways to measure prejudice, many of them are not very strong scientifically. This is important because these measurement tools are used in a lot of places, not just in academic studies, but also potentially in education and even in making important decisions. If the tools aren't reliable, we could be making bad decisions or drawing wrong conclusions about how widespread prejudice really is. The main takeaway from this massive review is that the field of measuring prejudice is methodologically diverse but psychometrically fragile. That is a fancy way of saying there are many tools, but many of them aren't built on strong scientific ground. So how did they do this huge review? They followed strict rules for systematic reviews like the PRISMA guidelines to make sure everything was done thoroughly and could be checked by others. They searched major academic databases for studies about racial and ethnic prejudice and stereotypes, especially those that reported on the quality of their measurement tools. If a study only talked about theoretical ideas or only looked at children, or if it didn't report any numbers about reliability or validity, they excluded it. They even contacted authors if information was missing to get more details. They compiled data on everything from the type of study design to the specific instrument used, its reliability, its validity, the factor structure, which is about how the test items group together, and even if the measurement worked the same way for different groups of people, which they call measurement invariance. They used the clever search strategy to find as many relevant studies as possible. Imagine typing in special code words into a super librarian to find books about prejudice. They used terms like prejudice or racism combined with racial or ethnic, and then words like validity or psychometric. This brought up a massive number of papers, and they had to carefully filter them down to the ones that provided the most useful information about measurement quality. After sifting through all those papers, they extracted key details from 263 studies. They wanted to know about the study itself, like when it was published and who did it, and importantly, who was in the study, like their nationality and age. They looked at how the data was collected, and crucially, they focused on the measurements used. What was the name of the scale or test? How many questions did it have? What kind of answers did people give? One of the most important parts was evaluating the psychometric properties. They used a system that rated each quality from 1 to 5. They looked at things like internal consistency, which means how well the items on a scale measure the same thing. They also looked at test-to-test reliability, which is whether someone gets a similar score if they take the test again later. Then there is validity, which is broken down into things like convergent validity, meaning if the measure correlates with other measures of the same thing, and discriminant validity, meaning it doesn't correlate too highly with measures of different things. They also checked for factor structure, which is about whether the test measures what it says it measures, and measurement invariance, to see if the test works the same for different groups. To get an overall picture of the quality of evidence for each measurement method, they used a system called GRADE. This is like a quality rating for scientific evidence. They looked at the risk of bias in the studies, meaning how likely are the results to be wrong due to study design or other problems. They also looked at inconsistency, which is when different studies get conflicting results, and imprecision, which can happen with very small sample sizes. Now, let's get to what they found. It is quite a mixed bag. First, a lot of the research is happening in the USA. Out of the 263 studies, nearly 60% were authored by researchers based in the USA, and over 67% used US-based samples. This means a lot of what we think we know about prejudice might be based on the American experience, which might not translate to other cultures. Also, most studies used a cross-sectional design, meaning they looked at data from one point in time rather than following people over time. When it comes to the actual measurement tools, most studies use explicit measures, which are basically self-report questionnaires where people directly say what they think or feel. Implicit measures, which try to get at unconscious biases, were used much less often. The most frequently used response format was the Likert type scale, where people select a number on a scale, like from 1 to 7. Some of the most popular methods they found were the modern racism scale, feeling thermometers, and the race implicit association test, or IAT. These are tools many of us have probably encountered in research. Here is a big finding: only about 1/3 of the studies clearly defined what they meant by prejudice or stereotypes. This is a major issue. If we aren't clearly defining what we're measuring, how can we be sure our measurements are accurate? Most studies also focused on prejudice at the individual level, like personal beliefs, and most often measured the cognitive part of prejudice, like stereotypes or thoughts, rather than the emotional or behavioral aspects. This is like trying to understand an iceberg by only looking at the tip. You can see in Table 3 that in over 41% of cases, the studies conceptualized prejudice as cognitive, and even more, over 50% operationalized it that way. This means the focus is heavily on what people think, not necessarily how they feel or act. Also, the alignment between how they define prejudice and how they actually measured it wasn't always there, in about 16% of cases. There was no correspondence at all between the conceptualization and operationalization of the level of the construct. For the components, about 10% showed no alignment between theory and measurement. Now, for the really critical part, the psychometric quality of these measurement tools. The researchers evaluated each property using a rating system. The overall picture is not great. None of the examined studies were considered fully satisfactory. The average psychometric score across all measures was critically low. Only a tiny fraction of methods, just 4%. If you look at the grade assessment later, got a high rating, meaning they showed no risk of bias, inconsistency, or imprecision. The vast majority of measurement methods received low or very low quality ratings. Digging into the details, certain qualities were often lacking. For example, good research practices, like pre-registration of studies and making data public, were rated as inadequate in almost 88% of cases. Content validity, making sure the test covers all the important parts of the concept, was also poor in over 81% of studies. And incredibly, hardly any studies looked at temporal stability like test-retest reliability, meaning they didn't check if people got the same score, if they took the test again later. Discriminant and predictive validity, which are super important for understanding if a measure really captures something unique and if it predicts real-world behavior, were rarely examined. This leads us to the grade assessment summary. It highlights that serious or very serious risk of bias and inconsistency were common. Inconsistency, meaning different studies finding different things or using flawed methods, was a big problem. Even for the most used methods like the modern racism scale, they received a low-grade score because of very serious inconsistency. Alarmingly, the race implicit association test and feeling thermometers, which are very popular, performed among the weakest in psychometric terms. So what does all this mean? The researchers conclude that the way we measure prejudice and stereotypes is conceptually fragmented and psychometrically fragile. Despite a lot of theoretical advances, the tools we use to actually study these issues are not built on solid ground. This is a problem because when flawed instruments are used in important areas like jury selection or policy making, they can actually end up reinforcing the biases they're supposed to expose. The paper offers some very practical recommendations for improving this situation. First, they stress the need for clearer construct definitions. Researchers need to be very specific about whether they're studying individual, ideological, or systemic prejudice, and whether they're focusing on cognitive, emotional, or behavioral aspects. They argue that we need more tools that capture the emotional and behavioral sides, not just what people think. Second, psychometric evaluation needs to be much more rigorous. It can't just be about internal consistency anymore. Researchers need to systematically test the nomological network, which means how the measure relates to other theoretically connected concepts, and crucially test for temporal stability, content validity, and predictive validity. They also strongly recommend testing for measurement invariance to ensure that measures work across different cultures and populations, something that has been largely neglected. Third, the field needs to adopt more integrative and multi-method approaches. Instead of relying on just one type of measure, like self-report questionnaires, researchers should combine explicit, implicit, and behavioral measures. This triangulation is key to truly understanding a complex construct like prejudice. Finally, And this is something we hear a lot in science news these days. Transparent and reproducible research practices are essential. This includes pre-registration of studies, making data open, and sharing materials. These practices help ensure that findings are credible and can be trusted. In conclusion, this study provides a crucial wake-up call. While we've made great strides in understanding prejudice theoretically, our ability to accurately measure it is lagging behind. The paper calls for a new generation of measurement tools that are psychometrically rigorous, theoretically coherent, and culturally sensitive. It is about moving beyond just asking people questions and towards a more comprehensive understanding of prejudice as a dynamic and multidimensional phenomenon. It suggests that right now, many of the tools we use might be built on shaky foundations. And this can lead to flawed conclusions and ineffective interventions. The good news is, by identifying these weaknesses, this research points the way forward for building better, more reliable ways to understand and ultimately combat prejudice. It's a reminder that good science requires not just asking the right questions, but also using and developing the right tools to find the answers. What do you all think about these findings? Does it surprise you that so many common measures might not be as robust as we assume? Let me know in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching!